I call to order the meeting of the Michigan Board of State Canvassers. First item of business on our agenda is public comments. Has anyone asked to speak?
We have Mr. Gallant on online, as well as any individual.
Mr. Gallant, you have 1 minute. Good morning. Mr. Gallant, are you there? So he apparently is not here, at least at this time. So if he wishes to speak later, we will recognize him. The second item on the agenda is consideration of the meeting minutes for the November 22nd, 2024 meeting. Do we have a motion?
I will make a motion to approve the minutes from the meeting held on November 22nd, 2024.
All in favor? Aye. The motion carries. The next item on our agenda is consideration of the 100-word summary of the purpose of the constitutional amendment sponsored by Axe My Tax. The summary is drafted by the Director of Elections, is as follows. Constitutional amendment to prohibit real and personal property taxes, shift 10% of sales, income, and other tax revenue from the state to counties, along with cities, townships, and villages, which would receive 20% of sales tax revenue instead of the current 15%. Allow local governments to use this tax revenue for essential government and infrastructure services, but not for schools, community colleges, parks, or other local government units, which currently receive most of their funding from property taxes. Require 60% of voters to approve any local taxes. Require 2/3 vote of legislature for any tax increase of more than 0.1% over 5 years, and require implementing legislation. The summary of the purpose prepared by the director can be up to 100 words. Our responsibility as the board is to approve or not approve or alter the summary which the director has drafted. The statute requires that the summary inform signers of the subject matter of the petition using words having a common everyday meaning to the public, but need not be legally precise. So we have requests to speak from Mark Brewer and Steve Liedl. Which one of you wishes to go first? Mr. Liedl?
Had a good Thanksgiving. Steve Liedl from Dykema. I represent the Citizens to Protect our public safety in schools. Just a couple comments on the proposed summary, which was prepared by the Director of Elections. I have shared this morning some comments on the proposed language. Would have liked to share those with you earlier. The director's comments were not made available, or proposed summary was not made available until 4:27 p.m. the day before the Thanksgiving holiday. But it's provided in the form of background information supporting some comments, and I'll provide some comments basically on 2 items. I'll focus first on the second phrase in the proposed summary, which indicates shift 10% of sales, income, and other tax revenue from the state to counties, along with cities, townships, and villages, which would receive 20% of sales tax revenue instead of the current 15%. Couple issues with that statement. One, it's not factual. The proposal wouldn't dedicate 10% of sales tax revenue to local units. And it also wouldn't increase the percentage of state sales tax revenue that cities, townships, and villages receive from 20 to 15%. There's a math error. The math does not accurately reflect what the proposal provides, which is a problem under the standard before the board. Because a petition, in addition to the standard that the chair described at the beginning of this agenda item, must consist of a true and impartial statement. So that means that the board has no authority to approve a statement of purpose with a factual inaccuracy. The board has discretion here. There are other areas where the board does not have discretion. But the statute only empowers the board to approve a summary that satisfies this standard. Also, by overestimating or indicating that local units and counties would receive a higher portion of the sales tax revenue than would actually be the case under the actual words used in the proposal, the statement arguably creates a prejudice in favor of the proposal, and I don't think it can be viewed as impartial for that reason. So let me describe the math error for you, right? The first is that it would shift 10% of sales tax revenue under the Constitution to counties. Currently, under the current Constitution, counties receive no sales tax revenue, 0%. If you look at the proposed language in the proposal prepared by the proponents of this proposal, it's not 10% of the state sales tax. It's 10% of the 4% portion of the sales tax. The state levies a 6% sales tax, not a 4%. So that's actually only 6.66 to around percent of all state sales tax revenue, not 10%. And so if the language of had indicated something other than all sales tax revenue, it would be correct, but it's not. It's also not correct to say that it would increase the portion that cities, villages, and townships would receive from 20% to 15%. Again, those references in the current Constitution are to the 4% sales tax, the 4% portion of the sales tax, which was correct at the time the state levied a 4% sales tax. But when voters adopted Proposal A in 1994, they added 2% to the state sales tax and dedicated revenue from those taxes to schools. And so it's actually 15% of the 4% portion is actually 10% of total sales tax revenue. And so this proposal would increase the total portion of state sales tax revenue dedicated to city, villages, and townships from the 10% under current law to 13.33%. And you don't have to take my word for it. The Citizens Research Council of Michigan issued a publication on October 17th of this year entitled Sustainable Funding for Local Governments. And in that proposal, it actually describes the percentage of sales taxes that are dedicated to schools. And it says that cities, villages, and townships annually receive 10% of total state sales tax revenue, and drops a footnote. Footnote 3, Michigan's Constitution states that cities, villages, and townships will receive 15% of the state sales tax levied at 4%. 100% of the additional 2% of the state sales tax levied is dedicated to the state school aid fund. So to me, the description of the portion of state sales tax revenue that would both be added or distributed to counties under the proposal is incorrect. Secondly, the 20% sales tax going up from 15 is also incorrect. I'd also note, as noted in the memo, the summary does not describe the impact of the proposal on taxes that are levied for bonded indebtedness. Unlike prior proposals, the Article 9, Section 6 of the Michigan Constitution, which indicates that limitations shall not apply to taxes imposed for the payment of principal and interest on bonds approved by electors or other evidence of indebtedness approved by electors. The proposal before you today actually strikes that language from the Constitution. Similarly, the Headley Amendment, when voters adopted that in 1978, indicated a provision for emergency conditions is established and the repayment of voter-approved bonded indebtedness is guaranteed. So the people of the state of Michigan in 1978 guaranteed the ability to levy taxes to repay bonded indebtedness. This proposal eliminates that ability and actually indicates that this provision of the Headley Amendment is altered or abrogated, which means it's either amended or rendered totally ineffective. The proponents also would alter or abrogate in their proposal that the power to tax is unlimited when necessary to repay general obligations of school districts to the state of Michigan. That language is also altered or abrogated, and I believe the impact on the inability to levy taxes to repay voter-approved bonds is a key subject matter of this proposal and should be reflected in any summary. I've prepared at the end of the memo in attachment B a markup to address these issues in the director's comments, and you can see a clean version of that at attachment C. Those would be proposed changes to address these issues with the proposed summary, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that the board might have.
Questions from any board members?
So you're saying that your proposed summary addresses all of the concerns that you've laid out here related to those altered and abrogated sections. It informs voters of that issue, and this addresses the concerns you have as a whole on the summary.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, you'll see the language proposed in the first phrase after property taxes. It would be clear that it would include those property taxes pledged to repay voter-approved bonds. So anyone potentially signing the petition would have notice of the actual impact of this proposal in either actually deleting provisions of the Constitution or altering or abrogating provisions of the Constitution that reaffirm the guarantee, the obligations of local governments to levy taxes necessary to repay the bonds that their voters authorized. And then also adjustments to correct the math error in the proposed summary that was presented by the director to you.
Yeah. And obviously I'm not a constitutional expert like yourself and others. So when I ask this of Director Braden, our legal, don't take offense, is what Mr. Liedl saying about the math error, is that correct? And is what he has proposed an accurate statement for us to, if we were so inclined to accept what he has offered, would that fit with your interpretation, Director Brader?
Well, I mean, in terms of the percentages, I mean, first I'd note, these percentages have not changed in the various versions of this proposal that the board has seen before. So, this issue of the 10% being a percentage of another percentage, this is not something that is newly discovered. I think we talked about this with the first version of this proposal, if I'm not mistaken. Can't really remember, but I think we talked about the first version of this proposal that it was 10% or 20% of a percentage. We also talked about at the last version of this meeting that, you know, currently municipalities are already getting 15%. So should that be flagged, or should we just say shift 10%? In the previous version of this proposal, the board approved a summary that just said shift 10%. And, you know, because of number of word issues, we didn't really get into these municipalities already get a certain percentage and now it's going up. So, you know, as far as the math is concerned, as far as I can tell, I think that these percentages in the proposed version from Mr. Lidl are accurate. I think the broader issue is that this level of detail or legal precision when it comes to the percentages is not something that the board has considered to be absolutely necessary in terms of a fair and impartial summary of the petition. Part of it is just spending all the words on percentages and how that can be confusing. Part of it is just whether this is necessary from a legal precision standpoint. I guess the broader issue is, I mean, it's accurate that the latest version of my summary was posted on Wednesday, but this proposal was shared with the public many weeks ago. Other versions of this proposal that had the same calculation have been available for months. So I believe, as far as I can tell, it would be accurate. I think the question is whether it's necessary to have this level of precision in the percentages. I don't know from a legal standpoint. I can't really tell you what, whether that constitutional argument is correct. I think it is, but I would have to defer to the AG's office in terms of whether that is the effect of the current constitutional language, the constitutional language as amended, and what the Constitution currently says about sales tax rates.
Question. Sir, just a question, and probably more of a legal question. The state and the communities, all these folks out there in the state right now that have bonds that have already been voted on, funds have already been received. Those funds are fixing our roads and paying schools and libraries, et cetera. As part of those bond issues, weren't the property taxes considered part of the surety that established the rate of interest, and aren't they part of the legal document that the bonds have underwriting them?
Not necessarily. The communities typically pledge in the instruments related to the bonds, to commit to levy taxes necessary. It's a general obligation, pledge in most instances.
It's
for
not
most
specific to property.
which we will levy whatever taxes, property taxes, because those are the taxes generally.
So that's
that
the
local-
question. So if
Right.
there's $100 million bond out there right now that in effect was negotiated in good faith a year ago.
Mhm.
And part of the collateral, if you will, I'm using the wrong term here, but part of what I would look at as collateral was future property taxes. And you now have a law that says we're eliminating property taxes. Does that violate the terms of existing bonds?
It perhaps may, right? But that still does not restore any legal authority under the Michigan Constitution for any of these local units of government to levy a property tax. This proposal, once it takes effect, flat out prohibits the levy of any property tax.
That's the question
And
I'm
the levy
asking
of any
is if you-
equivalent.
if-
Right, yeah.
If you and I negotiate a deal and I tell you I'm going to put something up as surety for that deal,
Correct.
and then I turn around and change that before I repay you, don't you have a case against me?
Perhaps, but
Or at least the ability to
Right.
recall the money early?
perhaps that could create, violations of those bond covenants, which would likely have devastating consequences for the credit ratings and the ability of local units of government to borrow money in the first place. But the problem is, what's in the proposal itself? Well, the proposal flat out eliminates without exceptions any authority from the time it takes effect to levy any property taxes or to levy any equivalent tax, right? And, it's not as if the voters in amending the Constitution haven't been down this road before. So when the voters set limits on property taxes in the 1963 Constitution in Article 9, Section 6, they created an exception to avoid the exact circumstance you raise, an exception to levy taxes necessary, notwithstanding these new limits on property taxes, to assure that obligations of local units of government to repay their bonds were satisfied. Notwithstanding the limits, taxes could be levied to meet those contractual obligations. In 1978, when voters adopted the Headley Amendment, same thing. They went so far as to say, notwithstanding all of these restrictions on the levy of taxes and requirements for voter approval that previously didn't exist, we are going to guarantee in the Constitution the ability of states or local units to levy taxes to repay those obligations. And it's not as if local units have any other authority generally to levy taxes. Property taxes is the primary funding source for many, if not the sole source of funding for many local units of government. And then lastly, the provision relating to the state revolving loan fund where the state provides loans to school districts. That provision of the Constitution, which would be altered or abrogated under the text that the proponents have put before you, would require local units levy whatever taxes are necessary to repay the state loans to school districts. And this proposal will alter or abrogate that requirement. So you have three instances by the text submitted by the proponents themselves of language that protects bondholders and the credit ratings of local units of government in the existing Constitution that is either flat out deleted or altered or abrogated. And what does alter or abrogate mean according to the Michigan Supreme Court? It means to amend so that you change the way in which a provision operates, or to abrogate, which in plain language means to render it completely ineffective. And so we're abolishing all these protections for bondholders in this proposal, and that's not reflected in the summary. I think voters should be advised of that, because we know that in 1978 with the Headley Amendment, there's language in there to reassure folks about the consequences.
Is it, so again, just to conclude that thought, in effect, the way this is worded today has the potential to destroy the bond rating and the credit rating of the state of Michigan.
Absolutely. That is a potential outcome of the impact of this proposal if voters were to adopt it. And for that reason, in my view, voters that are potentially signing the petition should be advised of that potential impact, right? It's certainly something the drafters of the proponents of the proposal intended. They struck this language, right? They indicate that their proposal alter or abrogates these provisions. And so when voters in 1994 approved Proposal A, they had information, factual information with specific percentages. Your sales tax rate is going up from 4% to 6%, and your income tax rate will not go up by X percent as a result if you increase the sales tax from 4% to 6%. I think you could include those specific percentages, or you could address it in a different way. But what I believe that the board does not have the authority to approve is language that is factually inaccurate about the percentage of state sales tax revenue that will be provided to local units of government. And I think that's a flaw in the proposed language we have before you today.
Madam, I understand what you're saying, Member Housecamp, but it's not our job and our duty here to explore and dig into all the different ways this may or may not impact funding. I think what Mr. Liedl has said about addressing the concerns of at least notifying people that this alters and abrogates certain sections gets to what we're here to do, which is to provide a fair and accurate factual statement. And these folks have been here several times. They've asked the director to put something together. In my consideration of what Mr. Liedl's put forward, it addresses his concerns. So I guess I'm not sure why we're trying to dig into all the different maybes, maybe nots, what could happens. That's the case with any of these things that we propose. And if there's an issue related to some of this, I think that's something that then can go to the legal system into the courts to determine whether or not this has a fatal flaw because of that. But if we're looking at language that accurately summarizes this, Director Brader has stated that what Mr. Lidl has provided is appears to be accurate. I don't see why we don't try to incorporate some of that into this.
I understand what you're saying. But I have a couple of questions still about this, essentially eliminating the ability to repay bonds. You said that, you know, and I know that you're not a bond lawyer, nor am I, but you use the term general obligation bonds. So it would be, for example, if the city of Detroit issues a bond, the city has an obligation to pay it, period, whether it's from property taxes or anything else.
Mhm.
And if it doesn't have property taxes, then it doesn't have anything. But that's what the term general obligation means.
Yeah, essentially, we pledge, our full taxing authority as necessary to repay the bonds. If there's something less than that pledge, there might be less interest in the private financial markets to do it. That's compared to like a special revenue bond, for example, where the city might pledge the revenue from a city-operated parking garage to pay for the cost of constructing or repairing a parking garage, right? That would often not be a general obligation pledge, and it wouldn't pledge property tax revenue. It would pledge revenue, from parking fees.
You have any idea what the total outstanding bond obligations are of cities and townships in Michigan? Or
That's
of the state, including the state?
Yeah, that's not a number that I've pulled, but certainly it would be in the billions of dollars. I mean, there are school districts that are routinely proposing to their voters, obligations of 50, 150 million for capital improvements, like, for example, to build a new high school, for example. And if voters decide, to approve that borrowing, they're also authorizing the levy of a specific property tax to repay those bonds. And school districts in particular have no other tax levying authority. Proposal A, as you may recall, severely restricted the ability of local units to raise revenue from a source other than the property tax. And so I do think that is an important component of the, subject matter of the proposal. What is the purpose of the summary? To provide information to potential signers of what the proposal would do. And that's a key component. It eliminates 3 provisions of the state constitution intended to protect bonded indebtedness approved by voters.
You raised one other issue, and that is that the director's summary referred to other tax revenue, and you suggested that it is not all other tax revenue, but only limited tax revenue that would be.
Yes. And I think this is an issue where if you look at the summary initially proposed by the proponents in the petition they submitted to the Bureau, we agree that to eliminate that lack of clarity, in my view, that rather than saying other state taxes, which could mean all other taxes, right? The state levies a number of taxes. This does not pledge revenue from all of those state taxes to the local units. It only pledges state revenue from the sales tax, the income tax, the tax on marijuana products, alcoholic beverages, and tobacco products to local units. And so I think that the issue with using the phrase other tax revenue in the director's proposal suggests that or implies that it's could be other taxes, right? There's nothing that limits that other tax revenue, right? Sales tax and other tax revenue. And I think that is misleading. I don't think it's not factual, but I think it could be interpreted, as, providing bias or suggesting that to potential signers, that more state tax revenue would be provided to the local units than would actually be the case. We do have a proposal that, eliminates something, I think the state levies, the number as of 2023, according to the State Tax Commission, was, what's the number as of 2023? $16.1 billion in property taxes, right? And then you add onto that the 2.6 billion in property taxes, the state levies, through the state education tax. That's a total of $18.8 billion that were levied on property taxes in the state. And there's a small amount of that would be replaced with the replacement revenue from the state that would be shifted from state programs like state police and corrections to local units under this proposal. And my issue with the language used in the summary is that it suggests that it could be more state revenue is actually being case. It's only a portion, 10% of the revenue from these specific taxes. And the proponents of the proposal appear to agree because they listed those specific taxes in their proposed summary.
Other questions for Mr. Lidl? Did you want to address questions to the attorneys?
I-
To our attorneys, not to Mr. Lidl.
He will
or-
probably want to interject in this, it's for Steve and Director Brader, folks on our side here. If we were to direct Mr. Brader to adjust to meet these concerns from Mr. Lidl, would the petition header where it lays out the full text of the proposal appears on the reverse side, existing constitution, which would be altered and abrogated provisions of existing constitution, blah, blah, blah. Would we need to add that section that you are saying is altered and abrogated, or is that already included in that list?
Well, I'm happy to provide my answer and let the director or the AG's office speak for the Bureau and the state. In my view, no. I want to state, for the record, I am only here on agenda item 3, which is the statutory process for review of a 100-word summary. I reserve the right to raise later issues with the petition or whether or not provisions are altered or abrogated. There is no process under current state law for a review by this board of whether provisions are altered or abrogated. The legislature hasn't spoken to that. They've spoken only to the 100-word summary. The altered or abrogated provisions that I'm referring to today are the provisions that the proponents themselves indicate in their petition would be altered or abrogated by their proposal. So this is not me saying other provisions of the state constitution related to bonded indebtedness would be altered or abrogated. I'm only relying on the text that the proponents themselves have used in their proposal.
I guess what I'm getting at is if we adjust the summary to reflect this concern of an altered and abrogated section, I don't want the summary to reflect something that's not then listed as an altered and abrogated portion. Because then we've got a conflict for the.
Yes. If you look at the petition itself, the three provisions that would be altered or abrogated, if you look at the full text of the proposal, in Article 9, Section 6, there is reference to the foregoing limitations shall not apply to taxes imposed for the payment of principal and interest on bonds approved by electors. Right? That's in Article 9, Section 6, and that is in their list of sections altered or abrogated. The next provision is in Section 25. Well, I'm skipping one. The state loans to school district provisions. This is on the second page of their proposed petition. And you will see under section 16, a heading bonds, state loans, repayment. The the next heading below, power to tax unlimited, the power to tax for payment of principal and interest on bonds hereafter issued, which are general obligations of any school districts, shall be without limitation as to rate or amount. Because they limit the rate or amount of taxes that can be levied, they indicate that this provision is altered or abrogated. And then lastly, there's a provision in the Headley Amendment, section 25, relating to emergency conditions established for the repayment of voter bonded indebtedness, which is guaranteed. Those are the three provisions that the proposal itself indicates it would alter or abrogate. The first would actually be deleted. And so in my view, there would be no need to affect the language on sections altered or abrogated. They already indicate that these are sections altered or abrogated.
Doesn't the text of the proposal itself completely strike Article 9, Section 6, except for, it's,
Yes.
right, so,
Yes. And so that is the content of the proposal itself. I mean, this is, just.
right, it's not just that it
Right.
alters and abrogates, it specifically alters
Right.
and abrogates.
When both the director and this board is considering what the summary of the proposal should be, remember what the proposal is. It is not simply the language added or changed, right? It includes the language deleted from the current constitution. That is being proposed. What else is being proposed? The sections that would be altered or abrogated. So what is the subject matter of the entire proposal, including additions, changes, deletions, and provisions altered or abrogated? It's all of it, right? So this reference to bonded indebtedness is in there 3 times, right? And, that's enough to me. 3 is a magic number to make the case that voters should be provided notice before signing that this provisions affects, taxes levied to repay voter-approved bonded indebtedness.
Did you reference this? Didn't I hear you reference section 25?
Yes, Article 9, Section 25. So the 3 provisions that relate to bonded indebtedness as taxes levied to repay those bonds, Article 9, Section 6, that language is stricken. Article 9, Section 25, there's no changes to the language of that section, but it is listed among the sections that are altered, amended, or abrogated, rendered, ineffective by the proposal. And then Article 9, Section 16, which is also in the provisions that are listed as altered.
Those 3 are on the petition.
Yeah, they're on the petition article.
So
This is the.
there's a really long way of answering my question,
I got you. Okay. I'm looking at this.
probably because I didn't ask it very hard.
I was referencing here.
It's, we're just coming back from Thanksgiving weekend, everyone's like tuning into this
You're
again.
still stoned on
And-
tryptophan?
Sure. And this is too much turkey, too much gravy. The brain's working a little, but those are the provisions that are in the
This is what-
proposal. So the short answer is no, I don't, my view would be you would not need to alter any other provisions to provide notice to voters of the impact on bonded indebtedness.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a question, but it's not to Mr. Lidle. It's okay if I ask? So one of the things that's been used is this term essential government and infrastructure, which is laid out in the petition, which kind of going through here, I guess this is where I'm at. It's like, it's public safety, it's first responders, it's law enforcement, it's fire, it's courts, it's EMTs, it's 911 call centers, and then going to the infrastructure, obviously utilities. But it doesn't say anything about actually funding daily local government operations. Like other services that your local municipalities provide. I didn't know if we're going to what is in the petition. There is, I am not a tax person. That is not me. But there's nothing in here. I understand like in here, we list schools, that there's nothing for schools or community colleges or parks and other local government units. But what about general operations for a local municipality?
I think one of the issues that you're raising, if I can respond, is that their definition of essential government services is very limited, but in 100 words, it's really very hard to summarize the impact of this extraordinary proposal.
I understand that. And what I guess I look at is I live in a township where individually we pay for our own individual garbage collection. But in other municipalities, the city pays for the garbage hauling. If what we are doing is laying out taxes, but we're not laying out what kind of services are, I know it's hard, and this is where I guess the other question, and it might be just my own ignorance, is, but we just went through an election. Who is paying for those? Who is paying for the upkeep for voting machines? All of those things. If we're just laying out fire, police, and EMS, and then utilities and such, but we're not talking about general daily government operations of any village or city municipality. I know it does go by population, but it's just a general question I have, because I find the word essential, they're laying out in this petition what is essential, but that might not be the definition for an every average day voter that's walking out of a grocery store or walking out of a ball game or walking out of a football game. They might have a completely different definition of what essential is, which again, for me, is never put your name on anything you don't read. Read that 3-page document that just got put in front of you when you're talking about taxes. But I don't know how to address it, but it's come in front of us every single time it's come in. But I don't know how to address it, but I wanted to at least say something about it.
I would only note that essential doesn't seem to include the conduct of elections. But that's a minor quibble. Right, but it is not, right. What we are looking to do is to provide a true and accurate summary of the proposal,
Right.
a true and impartial statement.
I'm happy to share.
And it's very hard to do that when the proposal is so extensive.
I'm happy to briefly share my perspective on that. I mean, I tend to agree with Director Brader on this. It is hard to summarize in 100 words, and the statute does not require the summary to be overly legalistic. And right, when we get into the contents of a definition, one, you're getting somewhat legalistic. Two, I don't know how you do it in 100 words, given everything else that should be highlighted to petition signers. I mean, they do have the details that if they're signing, they can look on the petition, hopefully online. I will share my proposed one word to address this. I added the word only. So allow revenue use only for essential services and infrastructure services. To me, that sort of conveys the more limited sense in which it could be used. Another way to address this might be to say for limited essential government and infrastructure services, when you can do it in one word. I think the problem with that is it begs a question to voters like, well, what limited services? And the summary would not answer that. Yeah.
Any other questions for Mr. Lidl? Mr. Brewer?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lidl.
Before Mr. Burr starts, do we have anyone here from the petition drive?
Nobody has
speak.
asked to speak, but is there somebody here from Ax My Tax? Okay. Mr. Brewer? Good
Thank you,
morning.
Madam Chair, members of the board. Mark Brewer from Goodman Acker on behalf of Michiganders. For the Commonwealth, I have three brief points to make for you here this morning. First, as with Mr. Lidl, and I apologize for the quality of my voice, I'm addressing only the summary, not the form of the petition or the alleged list of provisions altered and abrogated, which remain significantly defective. All that's before you this morning is a summary, and that's all that I'm addressing as well. Second, I agree completely with Mr. Lidl's analysis. The proposed summary has significant factual inaccuracies. This is not about legal precision. The statute under which you're operating says the statement has to be true. And everything that Mr. Lidl has pointed out goes to truth or falsity of the proposed summary. And his alternative summary corrects those false statements. Finally, with all due respect to bondholders and to people concerned about the credit rating of the state and school districts and local governments, this proposed summary kind of buries the lead. Last winter, when this group was here before you and you approved a summary 4-0 on which they could have proceeded. Why they withdrew and now are back before you, that's something for them. But they could have gone forward under a unanimously approved summary last winter. And one of the critical items in that summary was that it mentioned right up front that property taxes are the key revenue source for schools, parks, libraries, community colleges, and other entities in the state. Now, to the credit of the proposed summary, that line is in there, but it's buried. You buried the lead, essentially, in this proposed summary. So if there's anything that I would ask be amended to Mr. Lidl's fine summary, is that a way be found, and I think a way can be found. That phrase, that property taxes are the principal revenue source for these many school districts and other entities, be moved to where it was in February. And I think that can be done within the 100-word limit. That is the only suggested change I would make to Mr. Lidl's otherwise true and accurate and very good summary of this proposal. With that, I'll be glad to take any questions.
Questions for Mr. Brewer?
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, yes.
So you have suggested that the line, both in Director Brader's summary and in Mr. Lidl's proposed summary, that the phrase regarding revenue for schools, community colleges, parks, et cetera, be moved high, that be placed higher in the summary. But it is not just the revenue for schools, community colleges, parks, and other local units, but also the revenue for cities and townships, right? So it's for every governmental entity. So I'm just wondering if you.
Right, well, what you did last winter, you used the phrase schools, community colleges, parks, and other local government units. So you kept it relatively short, perhaps a dozen words, because again, we're all operating under constraint that you can only use 100 words, right?
Right.
So to express that thought at the beginning of the summary, as you did last winter, rather than bury it 2/3 of the way down. I acknowledge that it's there. I'm not saying it's completely absent. There is a reference to providing no replacement revenue. But the predicate for that is that this currently is the principal source of revenue for schools, parks, et cetera. That predicate is missing from the summary.
Cities and townships.
Cities and townships. That's right, Madam Chair. But the predicate for the replacement revenue line
Right,
is
it
missing.
goes to those, right, entities. I understand. Okay. Any questions? Okay, Carla Wagner has asked to speak on behalf, I believe that you are a representative of Axe My Tax.
Carla Wagner from Axe My Tax. I'm not an attorney. I'm just a
Okay, can you
taxpayer.
spell your name?
Yes,
Please.
Carla, Karla, Wagner, Wagner. So I'm looking at the proposal that
Would
Mr.
you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. I'm looking at the proposal that Jonathan Brader wrote, and I think with the exception of the items that these two gentlemen brought up, that when I first looked at this, I thought that this was doable. And I think it was Mr. Lytle that brought up on the second line of Mr. Brader's proposal, it says shift 10% of sales, comma, income, comma, and other tax revenue. And he took exception to that. And I think we could very easily replace those words with alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco. Because I think we're switching about 3 words for 4 words, possibly, or 4 for 4 there, and still be in that. And then if we needed to, when they talked about the bonds, and I've talked about bonds with township supervisors and county commissioners, I've talked to them about bonds, so I understand somewhat of the concerns about existing bonds. How would those be paid? But as far as this proposal, after the word infrastructure services, we could put comma bonds, so that allow local governments to use this tax revenue for essential government and infrastructure services, comma bonds, or existing bonds. If that would make it better. Other than that, I thought the one Jonathan Brader wrote was pretty easily readable, easily to understand. When I believe it was Mr. Lytle brought up percentages and numbers and the things that I just received this today, so I'm just looking at his when he's going from 10% to 13.33% and from 0 to 6.66%. We went with percentages because those were easier for people to understand. And what we can't make them understand is a percentage of what? 10% of what? 10% of 1 million, 10% of 10 billion, 10% of 20 billion. You can't put that in here. So I don't think the percentage, when what we looked at was, what is the percentage, the House Fiscal Agency here on your flow chart, it uses sales tax. It says 15% of the 4% rate. Okay, we just want that to say 20% of the 4% rate. Does it have to be a, 6.5798%? I don't think so. I think we can go from 15% to 20%. That is a general understanding. People will understand that without having to go through all the decimals. That it just makes it more confusing. And I thought the summary was to summarize something to make it easily readable and easily understandable.
You seem to be changing your proposal as
I'm
I
not
understand.
changing the proposal, it's the summary that's changed multiple times. So I'm just trying to
Right,
make it work.
but Mr. Lidl has raised what seems to be a significant question about whether or not bonds, which have already been issued, and which the local municipalities and state are responsible for paying and anticipate paying with property taxes. You're now saying that they will pay for those bonds as part of essential services?
Well, if it
But that's
comes,
not what you're.
what I'm
you're-
trying to understand is, so I live in a school district that just passed a 20-year millage, bond proposal millage. And I believe it was a millage for playground equipment. 20 years for playground equipment. How do they know what the need for playground equipment is going to be in 20 years into the future? Or are they just locking it up? We see townships now that are starting to request millages be put on a ballot before the millage has even expired. They're looking 2 years out and saying this millage is going to expire in 2 years. We're going to put it on the ballot now. How do they even know what that money is going to be used for? What we're trying to do is just say, there's got to be a better way than taking someone's house to pay for some of these services. I understand that property taxes pay for a lot of things, but the penalty for not being able to afford a property tax is the loss of your house. How devastating is that? How devastating is that? And when we are moving into a state that is becoming more and more of a renter's state, we are losing private ownership of land. We are losing small businesses. We are losing other businesses. And then we have a current administration that gives property taxes away. We pay companies to come into Michigan, and then we forgive them property taxes for 30 years.
So we are not talking about the merits of your proposal. You're talking about it. But we're just looking for an accurate summary of your proposal.
And as I said,
And
I think
your proposal does not indicate that essential services indicate payment of bonds. It doesn't say that. In fact, to the contrary, it eliminates the provision which requires repayment of bonds. And so we cannot change the summary to make it something that you think might be more palatable. In fact, your proposal.
Then leave the word bond off. Then
I'm
just
sorry,
change
what?
it, like I said, change it, what Mr. Brader wrote. We can change the other taxes for alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco. And it seems like he's got pretty much everything else covered in there.
But he doesn't have.
I was just flagging,
Yeah,
when,
I'm sorry.
when you are ready, I've got a
Oh,
question.
yeah,
Yeah. You can keep going. I just wanted to.
No, go ahead, Ms.
So this question is for our legal counsel, which it looks like they're deep in conversation probably about what I'm about to ask. Because I have the same concern about what Ms. Wagner has said about changing it to reflect that, okay, it's essential includes paying for bonds. But that is in direct contrast or conflict with Mr. Lidl's statement that it wipes that out. So who's correct? Is Mr. Lidl correct, or is Ms. Wagner correct? Because I think it's important to get that right.
I want to make sure I understand your question, Member Dunn, so that we give you the correct answer. Is the question you're asking about whether or not is that the idea that the summary reflect the proposal content, or is it a question about the board's authority?
It is about the summary reflecting the content in the sense that if we add this portion about including those pledged to repaying voter-approved bonds, is that a correct interpretation of the proposal? It does prohibit that.
I think the answer to the question you're asking then is that the summary has to accurately reflect the actual language of the proposal.
Yes.
And I think that's a question that has to be decided by the board in front of the witnesses, is what is the content of this proposal, and where in the proposal does it provide for the payment of bonds, so that the summary can say that.
Prohibition of the payment of bonds.
Right. Same.
I think so the statute for the summary says it doesn't need to be legally precise. It does need to be true and accurate. Case law, suggests it's not appropriate to try to predict future interpretations of an amendment. So we can't do that. We've got cases that say that. So we're really stuck with just what do the words on this page say? Like, what do the words say? Not what we think a court might interpret them or how they might be applied in the future. So at least that's the case law that we have right now. So we really need to focus on reflecting what the actual proposal language is. And you know, and with all due respect, you know, we received Mr. Lidl's document this morning as well. So we've had no time to think about any of these things any more than you guys have. So, you know, these are difficult questions, but the advice that we can give is what the case law says and what your statute says. So I think that's about the extent of our advice at the moment. That makes sense.
I'm looking at the proposal itself, not even the language about alter and abrogate. And it specifically eliminates the language which would require repayment of bonds in Article 9, Section 6. So I don't, that is what it says. And the proposal also specifically defines essential services. And it does not define repayment of bonds as an essential service. It's not really a service, but it doesn't define it as essential in any way. So that I think it certainly looks to me like the proposal for the modification of the summary language proposed by Mr. Lidl, so that it would include, that it prohibits property taxes, including those pledged to repaying voter-approved bonds. That appears to me to be both a true statement of the proposal, which I think is essential to convey to anybody being asked to sign the petition what the proposal actually suggests, and that is that you know, that the municipalities which have pledged their credit based upon the anticipation that they would receive property tax income, when they no longer receive that income, their credit will plunge, and that is something that I would hope that people would want to understand. I also think that the numerical changes that that Mr. Lidl has provided seem, you know, I certainly think that his calculation is accurate, that the state sales taxes, it's not the sales tax levied at the 6% rate that gets allocated. It's only the sales tax leveled at the 4% rate that gets allocated,
And that's in
both
the,
currently and
proposal.
in the future. So I think that those numbers that he suggests are true, which is what we're looking for. Director Brader, do you want to work on, if we thought that these changes, suggested changes were important, do you want to
Well,
work on them?
yeah,
a bit?
we can work on them, but we need to get some clarity on a couple points, I think.
Okay.
So, I mean, first of all, just stepping back, this whole process for the petition sponsor is optional. They do not have to ask for a 100-word summary that I draft and you approve. They can use their own summary. The benefit to them, obviously, of doing this is that if they do use the summary that I draft and you approve, then the board cannot later consider a challenge to the petition on the basis that the summary is misleading. So that's the benefit. You know, so the best case scenario, I think, you know, in terms of the efficiency of the process, is that we get a summary that meets the statutory requirements and that the sponsors, you know, agree is that they want to use. Of course, none of that precludes court challenges and other things like that, but at least it would resolve the issue of whether the summary is misleading or not, as far as the board's consideration is. The other thing, just to note, I mean, there's not a magic 100 words. That is the only 100 words that could be in compliance with the statutory standards. So certainly one version could be okay, and a different version could also be okay, and the goal is basically to get something that people agree with. In terms of the, the summary that was proposed by Lito, there's a couple things, Mr. Lito, there's a couple things, I just want to note. I mean, in the fifth line, where it says, allow revenue use only for essential government infrastructure services. It's really, it allows the revenue use that is specified in the amendment. Like that percentage of the sales and other state taxes that they get. That's what's allowed only for essential government infrastructure services. So when it says allow revenue use, that's a little bit inaccurate. That is inaccurate in my opinion, because it's not specifying that this is the revenue use we're talking about. So I think that would need some work, if that were the construction that were used by the board. I also think that, another change from what I had proposed and what the board had previously approved in terms of other local government units. In the Mr. Leal's summary, it just says other local governments. I personally think that's a little confusing, and I think it would cause signers to not really understand what we mean by local governments, because we're already talking about local government jurisdictions with cities, townships, villages, counties. So I think government units is better there. I think it also helps address some of the questions that Member Bradshaw had about other government services. Again, it's hard to summarize all the other local government things that could not be paid for, but government units is fairly broad. So between those two, I would go with that, although it is an extra word. Again, with the percentages, I think it is, my personal opinion is I think it's okay either way to either talk about the 10% and the 20%, generally speaking, without specifying that it's a percentage of a percentage. I believe that these percentages with the decimal points are more precise and also accurate. So I have no issue with that. We can do it that way. I think the toughest question in terms of, and it seems to be what, and then also in terms of like specifying income, marijuana, alcohol, and tobacco taxes as opposed to other taxes. If we can fit that in there with 100 words, I have no issue with that either. The original version of this I drafted did specify all those out, and we changed it to other, just I think for clarity and to save words. So if we can specify those, I have no issue with that either. I think that the trickiest issue probably is this one about the bonds. I think, what Mr. Lito was saying is that there is currently a structure in place where property taxes are levied and collected and used to pay bonds, and they've already been collected for those purposes. And there are bonds that municipalities owe money on going out years or decades from now. And we would be, this would take away the property taxes that were to be used to pay those bonds. And it doesn't answer the question of where the money would come from to pay those bonds, or like legally speaking, what would happen with respect to those bonds. I certainly can't answer that question for the board in terms of what would be the effects, the long-term effects of taking away the funding source that has already been specified for those bonds. So I think it's a question of whether, when we're talking about the purpose of the proposed amendment, because that's really what this is, the purpose of the proposed amendment, is this effect on currently pledged funds something that should be included to make sure that the summary is true and fair and impartial? Should it include some mention of this issue about the bonds? I think it's a tough one. I mean, we also had a similar discussion with the previous version of this about, including the fact that currently property taxes are the source of funding for, or the primary source of funding for schools, community colleges, parks, and other local government units. That factual statement is not in this exact, it's not in the proposal, that factual statement, but it is a consequence of this that the board, believed that it was important for the signers to understand that we're talking about the primary source of these functions. And so I think this is somewhat similar to that in the sense that right now, for those jurisdictions that have these bonds, the property taxes are also the primary funding source, or maybe the only funding source that's currently available to pay those. And it would leave a question of how they would be paid. It's a little bit less direct of a consequence, perhaps, but it is a consequence that, you know, somebody would have to answer the question of what would happen with that funding. So I don't think that it is absolutely necessary for this context to be included about the bonds. I also don't think it would be untrue or unfair or partial to include that if we can find the words for it. So I think it would be helpful just to understand what the board's view is on whether this factual reality about the bonds that is not, you know, that is not directly described in the amendment, but that would be an effect of it, you know, whether that is something that the board thinks should be included to ensure that it's a true and fair and impartial summary.
So am I correct in understanding then Ms. Wagner's interpretation of this bond issue is that your interpretation is that repaying the bonds is essential and therefore is covered in this proposal? Is when you were saying you wanted to add and bonds, that was essentially what you're saying was your interpretation is essential means paying the bonds?
Would you like to come back up, please?
I think bonds are essential when it comes to what is the bond being used for, correct? So we talk about infrastructure. Some bonds are for infrastructure, those types of things. And those are essential, but I think what we're getting hung up on, property taxes are not the only tax out there. Like for schools, when we talk about how schools are funded, there's multiple, I mean, state income tax, sales tax, alcohol, marijuana, tobacco tax, real estate transfer tax, all of those taxes provide revenue for the schools. It's not just property tax. And I think something that people are, again, what we're forgetting, when it is a bond proposal or a millage and it's put up for a vote, what happens when we vote no? Where does that entity that is seeking that bond proposal or millage then get their money? Because they do get turned down. There were community colleges this last election cycle whose millages and bond proposals were voted down. So when that happens, where does that entity get their money from?
They have less money.
But that's a,
They have less money. So what's going to happen as people have a harder and harder time paying their bills, paying their property tax bills?
They're not going to vote yes on those millages and bonds, and I understand that.
Exactly.
That's the point. What you have is right now, I don't know whether or not, and I've been reading this 3 or 4 times, I don't know whether or not that bonds are going to get repaid or not, according to the words that are in your petition in front of me. But you keep on saying about these things, but it doesn't matter. We have bonds
Sure.
that are out there that need to be paid. If this petition goes out and the signatures come back and we approve it, you're changing the constitution of this state to whether or not we cannot, I mean, we're asking our legal, the attorney, like, what's the interpretation? But I guess where I'm at is you've come up, you've said the same thing, but can you tell us in the words of your petition, currently what I'm looking at, which lays out what essential services are, what essential infrastructure is. And neither of those say anything about paying bonds.
I don't think I can make that statement because there's 1,240 townships in Michigan
No,
and there's
you're-
83
you're-
counties,
you're
and I don't know what's
I'm sorry,
essential to them.
I'm not, the petition that we have is what you want to change the Constitution to. And that's the question that I have is, does the wording of this petition that we are supposed to get a 100-word summary of, does it repay for bonds that are currently being paid, regardless of whether or not you approve them or not, whether you agree to them?
They're existing.
They are existing and
Existing
they
bond.
need to be, because I live in a school district that didn't repay a bond. It is not where you want to be. So the question I have is, does the wording of your petition that you're representing today, does it repay bonds in the wording that you have provided for us? This is what we're trying to figure
No,
out.
I don't believe it does because I can't make that determination of how those bonds are going to be repaid. I think I think a township could renegotiate a bond if it, but what I'm trying to do is to eliminate property tax. I can't possibly think of all of the other little things that might be affected by this,
You're going to
right?
change the Michigan State Constitution to remove property tax.
Yes.
That seems simple, but taxes, as we all can see here, are very complex. What I just want is a 100-word summary that shows what is inside the petition that is provided to the director. It's the director's role, and for us, is we have to approve that. And so that's why I asked the question.
And I think the director did state something about the bond, or it was Mr. Lytle. And,
Madam Chair,
you know,
I think
to prohibit
we need a recess.
property taxes, including those pledged to repaying voter-approved bonds. So I think that was in there.
Member. Okay, we have a request for a recess. So we will
Sure, I
take
think I have to go
a
put
10-minute
money in my
recess.
parking.
Will you come back up when we're done?
Pardon?
Will you come back here when we're done?
Sure.
Thanks.
I gotta go put some money in my parking.
Is it a?
Sure, yes. So during the break, we have a new proposed summary for the board to consider, and I'm sure that others will have opinions. So just noting on this that it does include the percentage changes to be more precise. It also mentions the bond issue in terms of the fact that currently the bonds are paid for primarily by property taxes. So that's put out front along with the other primary funding sources. I think those are the major changes. There are a couple other small changes just to save words, but the current summary is 100 words exactly. So for discussion, the new summary is constitutional amendment to prohibit property taxes, which currently are the primary funding source for schools, community colleges, parks, other local government units, and voter-approved bond repayment. Increased portion of state sales tax redirected to cities, townships, and villages from 10% to 13.33% and from 0% to 6.66% for counties. Shift 10% of other tax revenue from state to local governments. Allow local governments to use this revenue only for essential government and infrastructure services, but not for schools, community colleges, parks, other local government units. I'm saying we probably need an or there, but other local government units. Require 60% of voters to approve any local taxes. Require 2/3 vote of legislature for any tax increase of more than 0.1% over 5 years. So I will note, as I was reading that we probably need an or. If we were going to use this version, we probably need to add an or before the second other local government units, and would probably need to eliminate another word elsewhere. But
Can you remove the which currently are?
yeah, I mean, yes, that probably could be done, or just change it to currently. But that's, those are small changes that we could work in, but just sort of more broadly for discussion in terms of whether the board thinks that this is appropriate, and if the other, if the board wants to hear from the interested parties as well.
I have a quick question. So going through from the 10% to 13%, from 0 to 66.66% for counties, would that funding, is that the funding that is only supposed to be used for essential services? And then
Yes.
maybe take the sentence, shift 10%, that 10% would go after that? Or is the 10%, I'm asking because
Yeah.
like you've been reading this a lot longer than me, moving those two sentences so that shifting the 10%, that revenue is different than the other revenue, I'm assuming, is that?
No,
or am I?
as I understand the amendment, it would we would be increasing the amount of state sales tax that currently goes to municipalities.
Mhm.
And then we would also be now sending state sales tax revenue to counties. And we'd also now start sending 10% of our other tax revenue from alcohol, marijuana, tobacco to local governments. That would all be additional or new funding that would be shifted from the state to localities. But all of that, the localities could use only for essential government and infrastructure services.
So the shifted tax and the new revenue tax cannot be used for schools, community colleges, parks, and other local government unions.
Right.
Okay.
Question on the second to last line, require 60% of voters to approve any local taxes. Does that mean that any taxes in place when this is put in, does that mean any taxes now immediately go away from locals and now you have to reinstate those with 60% of the?
Not as I read it. So if there was some existing local tax that's not a property tax, I believe that would not be affected by this because it's set, the amended constitutional language would be units. So this would be Article 9, Section 31 of the Constitution as amended would say units of local government are hereby prohibited from levying any tax not authorized by law or charter when this section is ratified, or from increasing the rate of any existing tax above that rate authorized by law or charter when this section is ratified. without the approval of a majority. It used to say majority vote, now it would say majority vote of 60%. So as I understand that, it wouldn't eliminate some other local tax that were permitted by law. But you would need, if you wanted to increase it, you would need a vote of 60%. I don't know if others,
Does it
Attorney
need
General's
an-
office or others have different readings, but that's how I understand it.
Does it need the summary, does the summary need to add the word new in between any and local?
I mean, it could. I mean, I think what this summary is meant to explain is that if they want to do any new local taxes, they need 60%, or increase local taxes, they need 60%. Yeah, I mean, new would, I guess, make that more clear, but also it could be an increase. So it may not necessarily be a new tax. It might be increasing the rate of a current tax. So I mean, it could, I'm not opposed to the word new there. But it could also be like any new local tax or tax increase. And that would, now we're getting into more words.
I think one of the problems that we had with this originally, or at least at a prior meeting, was that there are many local units of government that are funded by property taxes that are not cities, townships, and villages and counties, right? So we wanted to, the summary to essentially identify property tax funded entities. They may be funded directly by property taxes or by bond issues, such as schools, community colleges, parks, et cetera. So, but the first sentence here, which refers to property taxes, which currently are the primary funding source for schools, community colleges, et cetera, seems to me it ought to say primary funding source for cities, townships, villages, and other government units, because otherwise you're not calling, it doesn't indicate that these principal government units are funded by property taxes. It's more important to identify cities and townships than Mr. Brewer's disagreeing with me, but those are the property taxes go principally to the larger governmental entities, including the state. The state levies a property tax, I believe. So so the amendment to prohibit property taxes, which currently are the primary funding source for cities, township, villages, and other government units. I think is more accurate. And then, so, and below it makes clear that these other government units like schools, community colleges, parks, et cetera, are not funded at all, let alone by this redirection of state tax revenue. And I understand that Mr. Brewer thinks that should be up front, but can't do everything. So I'm just suggesting that we more directly address cities, townships, and villages.
So you're just make sure I understand, the proposal would be to, at the beginning, instead of saying prohibit property taxes, which currently are the primary funding source for schools, community colleges, parks, or other local government units, just say something more like which currently are the primary funding source for local governments.
Or for municipal governments, for.
I know that at the last meeting, everyone agreed it was accurate to say that the property taxes were the primary funding source for these specific entities. I don't know if we talked about whether it was accurate to say they were the primary funding source for local governments writ large. I don't actually know whether that's accurate, like whether local governments primarily are funded by property taxes, as opposed to funding they get from percentages of sales tax revenue that they currently get. I just don't know the answer to that question.
Do you know the answer to that question? I believe that that local governments, cities, townships, and villages are funded by property taxes.
I think the structure of financing local governments of all forms in the state are either.
I'm sorry, what?
I think the structure of financing all local governments in the state is primarily based on property tax revenue. There are a few exceptions. There are about 10 communities that levy a city income tax. You know, even in some large cities, there's still more money generated by property taxes. There are a few additional local taxes that the state has authorized in limited communities, for example, because there are commercial casinos in the city of Detroit. There is a city tax on casinos in the city of Detroit. Those are the only commercial casinos. And there is a city utility users tax in the city of Detroit. But you know, in terms of like other revenue being available to local units to pay for things, remember, this replacement revenue can only be used for the defined essential services. So as the chair and others have suggested, simple basic functions of government, such as conducting elections to decide who runs our government, could not be funded with those dollars. So if property taxes are eliminated and you have no other taxing authority, you have no ability to fund your elections. You have no ability to comply with the Freedom of Information Act to spend money for those dollars. You have no ability under this proposal. So
Well, it certainly occurred to me that you wouldn't, that conducting elections is not here defined as an essential government service.
So I hope that answers your question. Happy to share a perspective on the director's summary, which we
You
think
couldn't
is.
even have an election to determine whether you should raise taxes because you can't have election.
We would have to pay
Right.
our own way to come here.
Correct.
Right.
Or to reduce taxes for that matter. You could not have an
Right.
election for that purpose.
So we could say to prohibit property taxes, which currently are the primary funding source for all local government units.
I'm happy to share, if you're willing, happy to share
I'm
perspective on the
happy
director's.
to
language.
have you share, Mr. Lidl.
Great. I think we generally applaud the director for we think is a very good summary. I think you have a difficulty in you're trying to do this in 100 words, right? And so we're totally comfortable with schools, community colleges, and parks, given the parity with the language used elsewhere. And I think a general notion is that a lot of folks, when you say the word local government, they don't necessarily think of schools, right? So I do think it's important to specifically use the word schools because they are certainly a type of local government that can't levy any other taxes other than property taxes. And there is no replacement revenue provided specifically to schools under this proposal. So I do agree with the director's construct. Two other quick comments. I think that there is on the fourth line towards the end a reference to other tax revenue, right? And sort of as indicated before, that could suggest, you know, all other state tax revenue, right? 10% of all other state tax revenue from state to local governments. I think a way to address that concern without changing the number of words is shift 10% of some state tax revenue to local government units. And then a last thing, if you're looking to find some words, two suggestions there to do other things. The wording uses both the phrase local government and local units, right? The proposal itself refers to the definition of local government if you look at the text of the full proposal in the Headley Amendment, right? And so the Headley Amendment uses the phrase local government, right? And so you could save a couple words by dropping units, in my view, and that would be consistent both with the language of the proposal and the Headley Amendment's definition, which is included in the alter or abrogate provisions of the proposal. And I think if you were also looking to find some words to do some other things, you could shorten the which currently are the primary funding source, now the primary funding for would be a way to shorten that which currently are and save a few words. So just a few suggestions to save some words if you're looking to do more, but from the perspective of my client, the citizens, to save our public safety in schools, I do think it would be clear to the voters that it's some state tax revenue, not all other state tax revenue
Perhaps
that's being shifted.
if it said, which are the primary funder for cities, townships, counties, cities, townships, schools, community colleges, parks.
Again, I think
And-
as
and
the director
others.
suggested, there's lots of ways to write this.
Right,
And
but that makes it clearer that it's not, that by identifying schools, community colleges, et cetera, that, I'm just troubled by the fact that it doesn't identify cities and townships, which provide more government services
right,
than those.
I don't disagree with you at all. And so, I mean, you certainly could find 3 words. I mean, I think
Right.
you get at least 2, if not 3, by eliminating
Cities,
units.
townships, villages,
right?
cities.
Or rephrasing, which is kind of a long phrase. I think it's a good phrase as it is, but if you're looking for more words, you could shorten the which currently are the primary funding source.
Funder for
I think those would give you
cities,
options to
schools, community colleges.
potentially do, something like you're trying to do and get something closer to a resolution that you can get 3 votes for, at least from the board. Happy to answer any questions on those suggestions.
6.6.
While there's a break, I just want to point out it's actually 24 local units that levy income tax, and under no way did I Google that to figure out if you were correct.
Right.
I just knew that off the top of my
I
head.
appreciate the correction.
Do you mean property tax, not income tax?
No, income
Oh,
tax.
income
yeah,
tax.
Yeah.
Ah. How many different kind of local units level property tax or issue bonds? That's an interesting question. So.
I want to add something else on the Director Brader's list, but I think Mr. Lidl brought up the point that I was making up to what was listed as essential services, essential government. If there's any way to either add listed or directed. I know, I'm sorry. Added another word. I think that the way I look at it is that if you're reading that as a summary and you're like, okay, well, the listed ones, like, I think that would kind of clear up for me, like, I probably should open up this petition and actually read it. Because it will list out which services are actually provided for with revenue. No, I already know, like, I'm saying, so if I'm walking out of the grocery store and you hand me this petition. And I'm like, all right, well, the whole point of the 100-word summary is to give you a summary of what's in the petition. And if I had the word here listed or directed, well, I should open this up. Again, I'll go back to the thing I've said at this board for a long time. It's a legal document. Don't put your name on it till you read it. I could go in here and then look under distribution of local governments, and it would actually list all of the things that that revenue should be used for.
Would be.
Well,
So,
just asking that one.
okay, how about constitutional amendment to prohibit property taxes, which are the primary funder for municipalities, schools, community colleges, parks, and other local government units. So municipalities, instead of counties, cities, and townships and villages. I think that,
Well, so there's still the question of counties there for one thing, if we say municipalities.
Not a municipality.
No,
So how about counties, comma, municipalities, schools, et cetera?
Madam Chair, if I may,
Mr. Brewer had
Right.
a suggestion.
my client agrees with all the suggestions, Mr. Lidl. If you eliminate the word units twice, you can then say municipalities and counties. Problem solved in the first list.
Wait, I'm sorry, what was that?
If you
So-
eliminate the word unit, as Mr. Lidl suggested, which appears twice, you've got two words then you can add to the opening line. And you can use that for county and municipalities. Done.
we talked briefly, I know that covered a lot of words today. We talked briefly about the issue of governments versus government units. The reason for using government units, in my opinion, is that when you're listing the things that tax revenue can be used to fund by local governments, and then you say not for local governments, I just think that's a little confusing for the reader to understand, well, the city or township can use this but not for local governments. They can use it for some local government functions, the critical
Right.
and the critical and essential infrastructure as defined by the amendment, but not for others. That's where I think it gets a little confusing if you don't have some kind of word to specify units of government.
Well, then, Mr. Brader, may I suggest rather than in that next last line where it says units, take units out and put services. Can't be used for other services beyond the essentials, which is the concern that member Bradshaw had.
So government and infrastructure.
I think he's saying use services instead of units.
Yeah, yes, in the last line. You're contradistinguishing essential government services from other services. That's the distinction there.
Right, that's fine with me. That would address my concerns in terms of just using something to delineate that it's part of the local government as opposed to the entirety.
And you still got sufficient words to make the changes at the beginning under Mr. Lidl's earlier suggestions. And you're still at 100 words.
But primary funder for municipalities, counties, schools, community colleges, parks, and other local government.
I think at that point you could say other local governments and save the
and
word
local
units.
Governments.
Yeah, and that part, I don't think it's as important. Because the first part we're talking about, the fact that property taxes are the current primary funder, or whatever we would say, for these things. So that I'm not as concerned about. I will just flag again, I don't actually know, like, what we agreed was accurate last time was that the property taxes were the current primary funding source for these specific things. I don't have before you a breakdown of the funding of all the city, township, village, county budgets and how much of that's coming from property taxes as opposed to the percentages of the state sales tax, at least that the municipalities currently get, and for any other funding they might get. If the board is sufficiently confident that it is accurate to say that like the municipal and county governments writ large are primarily funded by property taxes, then I'm comfortable with that, but
It is.
I'm comfortable with that. There are the other sources of income. I mean, Detroit has casino income and a tax, income tax, but Grand Rapids has an income tax and 22 other jurisdictions have income taxes. Is that correct? But they're small compared to property. Source as a source of revenue, right? So, yeah, so if we leave the ones we have, but add municipalities and counties.
I guess I would just, if we're gonna just put the entire jurisdiction, like if we're gonna say it's the primary funding source for counties and municipalities, it may not be necessary to list out these other sub-functions. I mean, it's not inaccurate, but if we need to save words, I don't know that we need to say counties, municipalities, schools, community colleges, parks, et cetera, at the beginning.
Well, I think it does highlight for people what these taxes pay. And then when you go on and see, because those are things that are important to people, schools particularly. But then when you go on to say that the other taxes are directed only to cities, townships, and villages, and not to these other entities, I think that makes clear what the proposal is doing. So the distinction between the entities which are currently funded and those which would be funded, I think is important.
That's clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's accurate either way, so it's just a question of, I'm comfortable with drafting it either way, but in terms of saving words, if necessary, was interested in the board's perspective on that.
We can squeeze it in and use words more. We can,
I think you're at or under 100, given what you've been discussing.
but that really, as we talk about it, it really highlights for me that it does tell proposed petition signers what the property tax funds and what any other alternatives would fund, and that is a more limited a more limited menu of governmental services. And it's certainly important. It is, I think, crucial to have the bond repayment in there.
So if we start this, if we say the primary funder for counties, municipalities, schools, community colleges, parks, would we still want to say and other local government units? In the first part of that?
Et cetera.
Or would we just say parks?
Parks and others. Can you say and others?
I think that's a little
leaving this way too
ambiguous.
open.
For local governments.
So one possibility would be to say counties, municipalities, schools, community colleges, parks, and voter approved bond repayment. And then later on, when we talk about the limitation on the revenue use, still talk about other government units.
That works.
Another option would be to leave the other local government units there.
Yeah.
But it
But I
costs
think
us
when you have
words.
the other local governments below, it's sufficient. It's a lot of words. 3.
Okay, that would
maybe
get us
4.
under 100 too.
Okay.
I do want to flag, I don't know if the petition sponsors want to. Did you want to speak to this?
If.
First thing, I just want to say thank you to everybody. I know this is a really complicated issue and hard to put into a 100-word summary. I do know that there are some townships that don't rely on property taxes. In fact, I've had some township supervisors tell me that they currently get enough money from the general revenue sharing of sales tax to cover everything in as far as their township operating expenses are. So they probably have a volunteer fire department or an unpaid volunteer fire department. They probably contract with the county for police, sheriff's department, so they don't have their own department. But they have said that they use the general revenue sharing dollars to fund their township. And the only reason they send out property tax bills is to collect for those other things, like the schools and museums, things like that. So it's possible, and I think that's what is also that makes this very difficult, is because when we talk about 1,240 townships and then villages, towns, cities, whatever you have, and the counties, there's so many and their needs are different. That's why it's been very difficult for us to make a blanket statement of what things are going to be like. What we know is that property taxes are killing the state of Michigan. It affects the economy. It affects people personally. There's so many exceptions to who pays property taxes and who doesn't pay. It feels like we're picking winners and losers. So I think there are multiple, in Grand Rapids, not that long ago, Grand Rapids initiated an excise tax to pay for an amphitheater. They came up with a new tax to pay for something that they wanted. But no one's going to lose their home. When someone loses a home to foreclosure, they not only lose their home, they lose a stable family life, they lose their equity, and they lose their generational wealth. There has to be another way to pay for these services other than taking people's homes, farms, and businesses away from them. That is the purpose of this proposal. And my thought is, if we are going to continue to rely on property taxes to fund essential services, people are to the point that they're going to start voting no on every single bond proposal and millage out there. So those entities that are seeking that money, if they're relying on property taxes to get it, they're not going to get it. And then they will have no other avenue to get the money they need. So sales tax, state income tax, real estate transfer tax, all of the multitude of other taxes that we pay could help pay for the things that property taxes pay. And we won't be creating more homeless people that we do not take care of, because even affordable housing doesn't take care of homeless people.
Ms. Wood, you've spoken to the issue of forfeiture of homes in every conversation that I've been involved in where you've addressed this board. And that seems to be, as you just said, at the heart of this whole movement. So my question to you is a different question. If that's truly at the heart, why not approach this from the standpoint of getting the legislature or making an amendment to disallow seizure of homes if property taxes are in arrears?
Because there would still be, it would just be an ongoing issue. I mean, because property taxes, if property taxes are still out there, the less people you have paying those property taxes, the more we're going to rely on those people and the more foreclosures we're going to have. And it's not just the foreclosure, it's the cost. So maybe maybe one couple can afford a property tax, but does that mean they should pay it at the risk of losing their home? It's not just you're losing your home. You have the ability, farmers, they live on the farm. They live in the house that's on the property that they're farming. So it's their business and it's their home.
Point being is that if it was removed, if forfeiture, if seizure was removed as a remedy for back property taxes, it solves all of your issues in one fell swoop, right?
Well, but what I'm, yes, possibly, but what I'm also trying to do is, we know there are essential services that need to be covered. Let's please stop covering them with property taxes at the risk of losing people's or taking people's property. Let's find other revenue sources for those essential services. Like I said, there's multiple, you could,
Well,
there's,
what we're dealing with is the proposal that you
Mhm,
drafted,
mhm.
not
Sure.
anything that might otherwise. And I live in Detroit. I know that that tax foreclosures have been a huge issue and that there have been a number of efforts, many of them successful, to deal with tax foreclosures and keep people in their homes. So I'm certainly sensitive to what you're
Mhm.
saying. But what we're trying to do is to describe what it is in 100 words
Sure.
that you have done here.
Sure.
And municipal finance is incredibly complicated. And your proposal to deal with it is also complicated and difficult to describe. So we're collectively struggling with that. And I think we're probably close.
I think,
Close?
My question to Ms. Wagner is the summary that the proposal that was just handed out. Do you have issues with what was handed out before we started having the conversations here? Do you have issues with what was handed out by Director Brader? That's my question.
this looks to be pretty much Mr. Lidl's proposal. I just thought it was a little cumbersome because it seemed like we were repeating ourselves a couple of times. I I don't know really how it's changed from the conversations that you've been having. Other than the percentages where you're actually putting percentages in there instead of talking about like 10% or 15% or 20%. I don't see that it's a whole lot different than what we had before.
Should we have Director Brader type up the next one after the proposed one, or however? Sorry.
Yeah, we can do that and we'll hand it out to everybody again. I do want to flag one other thing while we're doing math. I believe it's actually 6.67%. It would round to 6.67% for counties because it's a 6 repeating. We're talking about 2/3, basically 4 out of 6. It would be 6 point, and then 6 goes on forever. So I believe that's 6.67. So unless there's an immediate need to correct that math, we're going to have it 6.67 in the next version. Otherwise, we will,
Do you want to take another break?
yeah, we need to type it up and then we'll hand it out and
Okay.
come back in.
We'll be recess.
Okay.
Do you- I bonded for you.
Sure, I will read it and then I'll highlight a couple things that we tried to address. So the updated proposed summary is constitutional amendment to prohibit property taxes, currently the primary funding source for counties, municipalities, schools, community colleges, parks, and voter-approved bond repayment. Increased portion of state sales tax redirected to cities, townships, and villages from 10% to 13.3%, 13.33%, and from 0% to 6.67% for counties. Shift 10% of some state tax revenue to local governments. Allow local governments to use this revenue only for listed essential government and infrastructure services, but not for schools, community colleges, parks, or other local government services. Require 60% of voters to approve any local tax increase. Require 2/3 vote of legislature for any tax increase of more than 0.1% over 5 years. And that is 99 words. We did change some of the information at the front in terms of adding counties and municipalities and dropping local government units. We lost a couple of words in the primary funding source. There was the discussion about whether it's the funding source for all counties, et cetera. So it doesn't say all, it says, I don't think it did before either, but it just says primary funding source for. We did change that 6.66% to 6.67%. We changed other state tax revenue to some state tax revenue to address that question. We added the word listed before essential government services to Member Bradshaw's point. And then we also changed, I think, local taxes to local tax increase, 60% of voters to approve any local tax increase to capture the issue that Member Housecamp raised regarding the effect on current taxes, which I think better clarifies that this would be about new taxes or tax increases. I think those are the changes. And again, this would be 99 words. And we did hand out another copy to the folks who have spoken on this.
Comments or questions? Any, Mr. Liedl, do you have something to add?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to thank the board, the director's team for all the time and hard work. Citizens to protect our schools and public safety in schools supports the current proposal. We think it's a fair description of the purpose of the statement, consistent with the requirements of the statute, and would urge the board to approve the current version prepared by the director.
And we thank you for your great assistance. We wish it had come earlier.
I apologize for the late time. I'll do my best to get it to you as soon as possible in at least 48
Yeah.
hours.
Thank
in
you very
advance in
much
the future.
for your help in clarifying the proposal, the proposed summary. Mr. Brewer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michiganders for the Commonwealth support this summary. And again, as with Mr. Liedl, we appreciate everybody's work and willingness to negotiate and talk and work these things out. We think this complies with the statute. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wagner?
I'm not sure, but I think this is kind of important. We don't have, it says prohibit property taxes, but it doesn't specify real and personal property taxes. So that's what we've always had before in the summaries. It said real and personal. And I think when we're talking about the increase of the revenue, in the prior one, it was because of what we were doing was the sales tax to the local municipalities is basically 15% of the lower or the original 4%. It should be increased to 20%. That's what the proposal states or the petition states. So this says increased portion of the state sales tax redirected to cities, transfer, townships and villages from 10% to 13.33. The state sales tax is supposed to be going up from 15 to 20, which is what Mr. Brader had in his summary. It should be going from, he said 20% of sales tax revenue instead of the current 15. That is correct. That is the correct statement. So it shouldn't be increased portion of state sales tax redirected to cities, townships, and villages from 10 to 33 point, or 13.33. It's going from 15 to 20.
I think that we concluded that the calculation, the numerical calculations here were correct. Do-
So, I mean, I can address both of those. So
Please.
in terms of the real and property, I mean, we've had versions of it that have real and personal and that don't. If we can fit it in, we can put it in there. I think in past versions of it, there was a dispute about how this would affect like the alternative taxes that might be different for property tax or for personal property as opposed to real property. And so the real and personal was an important distinction there. I think this version of the proposal didn't have that, so it seemed less important, but I did have it in the original version because there was room for it. We probably could find room to get those words in there. We'd have to cut 2 others. In terms of the percentages, the issue that Mr. Lidl flagged, which was that when we're talking about going from 15 to 20%, it's 15 to 20% of the
Original
4 out of 6%. So the current, in the current constitution, municipalities get 15% of the 4% of the sales tax, which means they get 2/3 of the 6%, which is 4 out of 6, 2 out of 3. They get 15% of that. So multiplying those, they get a total of 10% of the revenues. And so now it would go up to 20%, but that's still out of 2/3 of it. So 2/3 of 20% is 13.33%. Similarly, with the counties, they currently get 0, but they would now get 10%, but that 10% is out of 4 out of 6. So it's 6.67%. So as I understand it, that is the precise percentage of the state sales tax revenue that these jurisdictions would get under this amendment, as opposed to currently, which is the municipalities are getting 10% because they're getting 15%, but that's out of 2/3 of the sales tax, which takes it down to 2/3 of 15, which is 10%. I apologize for all the math. So in previous versions of this, the summary didn't get into that. It just talked about the percentage of, the percentage increase as opposed to what the total percentage would be. I think personally, I think it's acceptable to do it either way. But it seemed like the board was preferring to go to the more precise calculations here. But we can certainly discuss that further.
So I guess my concern would be if we're going to be that precise there, why are we not being precise when we say of some state tax revenue? Because what we are really talking about is state income tax, alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco. So you're being really specific on the numbers in some instances, but then you're kind of being very general when it says of some state tax revenue. So which state tax revenue? Because we know we pay multiple state taxes. So we are directly hitting the state income tax, alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco tax. So to me, if we're going to be explicit on percentages, we should be careful to mention the buckets or the taxes that is being hit by those percentages. I mean, I just think to make it clear, right? Because people can, well, how much is state income tax, it's 12 billion. Okay, we're going to take 10% of 12 billion or whatever. You know, that to me is easier than saying which state taxes are we taking a portion of. I just feel that we should,
That's, it seems to me that's part of the complexity, that there's such a complicated tax system and there's a lot of words.
and there
to
is, and
squeeze into 100.
yeah, and you're right, but I do see a little bit of redundancy when we talk about counties, municipalities, schools, community colleges, parks in the second line, but then we also kind of spell those all out again on the third line from the bottom. So I'm not sure if we can replace some of where the revenue is coming from and insert a few more words in there.
Thirdly, I think
Yes.
it would be accurate. I would have no issue with adding the additional detail of real and property and the additional detail of those those specific tax sources, and other versions of this that I proposed had those things in there. So it'd just be a question of depending on what the board thinks, but it would just be a question of finding those words elsewhere. We'd have to cut some other words. I think we'd have to cut we'd be adding about 7 words, 10 words, so we'd have to cut about that many.
Don't see where that could come from. I think if you add real and personal at the top. Fourth line from the bottom, you could say shift 10% of some state tax revenue to local governments. Allow them instead of repeating local governments.
The second statement of schools, community colleges, parks, and other local government services is very functional here, I think. Because on the top here, you're saying, well, okay, property taxes currently are the primary funding source. Well, that's great. But down on the bottom, you're actually calling out and you're saying, this is what's going to happen if this goes through. You are not going to use tax revenues for these services.
I think it's essential as well, because when you're redirecting some state taxes to the cities, townships, and villages, that means all of these other entities get left out of the funding. So it's something that certainly clearly and truthfully identifies what this says and what the purpose is.
With what you have now, you mean?
I'm sorry?
With what you have now, you mean?
Right. I think what is there now
Right,
identifies.
I agree.
How about saying require 60% voter approval?
Gets rid of the word "to."
Right, then you get rid of and to. Well, except that you have to add of 60% voter approval of any local tax increase. For any local, require 60% voter approval for any local tax increase.
It's not like you're gonna replace, you just replace it. It's not like you're gonna get rid of it. You've already gotten rid of some, you already got.
Well, you get rid of one word,
Right,
get
and you
rid of
just
one word.
replace the other word
right?
with for, that's all.
No. Oh, right, that's right. Yeah, so you get rid of 2 words.
Right, primary. Well, we can try to lose a couple words and bring it back to you if that's helpful.
Okay.
I think we can do it.
Do you want to recess or
Yeah, I think that'd be
Okay.
helpful.
we will be in recess? A short recess.
I apologize. I do have one suggestion for what is otherwise good work, given a change. The phrase that begins, shift 10% of income, marijuana, alcohol, and tobacco tax revenues to local governments. It doesn't indicate that those are state income, marijuana, alcohol. There may be some taxes at the local level, for example, on income, right? And it would be misleading to suggest that 10% is shifted for that purposes. So what I would suggest to deal with that is after of and before income, add the word state. And then that would take you up a word. To save a word, here's one suggestion. In the last phrase, require 60% voter approval. I think you could drop the any and just say require 60% voter approval for local tax increases.
And make increase plural.
That's just one suggestion to save a word, but I do think it's not quite accurate and misleading to just say 10% of essentially all income. So just restoration of the word state to that phrase is kind of critical. Thanks.
Questions? I think marijuana is spelled with a J.
We spell it, in the state of Michigan, it's with an H under the legal,
Okay.
It's spelled that way in the state constitution,
Yeah.
thanks to the voters of the state.
And I'm wondering whether legislature.
I think grammatically, no, it's just reference generally to the legislative body, not a specific legislature. But I think folks typically refer to it commonly as capitalized legislature. You could raise the same grammar point on whether or not amendment should be capitalized as well, but I think it works exactly fine as the director has drafted it on those two items.
I think those are two suggestions.
yeah,
Eliminate
I'm
any
good
and
with that.
add
That's
state.
fine. Yeah, is there any, does anyone else wanna?
Ms. Wagner, we've added that clarification that you did about the state taxes that are now redirected, so.
Did you want to speak further?
Down the bottom. There's a little button
There's a little red button.
at the base, at the bottom of the microphone.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Thank you. I would, now that we're getting this close to it, I would like to be able to ask that we hold off voting on this until I can bring it to my attorney and share it with him. He was not able to be here today. So is that, and
Just mentioned.
yes,
Sharing is.
You know, you submitted it for our approval today, so I'm troubled that you want us not to act upon it.
well, without my legal representation here, I would
believe-
just like him to be able to look at it with me
That
since
we
we've
have,
changed it.
Director Brader can correct me, but we have a limited period of time to approve a 100-word summary after you have submitted it to us for approval. And I'm not, we have a meeting scheduled for the 16th, but I don't believe that this should be, I don't think it can be put off.
I mean, this is our last meeting where this can be approved. It has to be approved by the 4th. So we don't have another meeting till following week. It's sort of up to the board, I guess. I mean, this is the meeting we had scheduled for this, so I don't.
Right. So if you don't, if you want to withdraw the petition again,
No,
Okay. Then I think that we,
Sorry. Just, can I have a second?
yes.
Yeah, so I mean, we haven't had this question before, sorry. Um, so I mean, at this juncture, I guess the board could vote to approve this or not to approve it. This is the meeting that we have, which is within the time period to consider the petition. So if it's not voted on, then, you know, unless the sponsor withdraws it, if it's not voted on, then the board would either not be voting on it or they could be voting on it outside of the 30-day window, but we haven't ever done that before, so I can't tell you exactly what the consequence would be. So it seems like the options would be for the board to vote on it or for the sponsor to withdraw it. I'm not sure there's a third option that I can recommend. Are there any other options? I don't know. That's all I got. Sorry.
Okay.
I mean, the statute, you're supposed to act within the 30 days. There's not a penalty for not acting in the 30 days, right? It's not like the statute says, and it all starts over, or, you know, something like that. It just provides a window within which you are supposed to act. So what happens if you don't act within the 30 days? I guess we wouldn't know for sure since we don't have a court that's addressed that. So either you can, seems there's some discretion into what that means. You could give her the extension that she's requesting, or we go to another meeting, or you vote on it today, or you could determine that if we don't meet the 30 days, then this should start the process all over again. But I heard her say, Ms. Wagner say she doesn't want to resubmit it, right? So
Yes, Tony.
I think we should vote on this. Unless they want to withdraw, but we've spent nearly 3 hours on this good faith effort. And I think I was okay with a couple versions ago. So my patience is wearing thin on much of this. And I'm sympathetic with Ms. Wagner's desire for her attorney to see this. But he should have been here, if that's the case. You know, I know that costs money to have people come and sit in these, but this is the meeting scheduled for this. And frankly, from a practical matter, I think if the attorney is going to see it and have things they want changed, so we'll go through this exercise again, and it's unlikely that those changes are going to get 3 votes. Or they'll say, yeah, this looks good, so why did we wait? So I think we should vote on this and be done.
I agree.
Do you have the revised version I just printed out? The only change is, I'll just reread the whole thing.
That'd be great.
But the change is just we added state and we said for tax increases at the end. So constitutional amendment to prohibit real and personal property taxes, currently the primary funding source for counties, municipalities, schools, community colleges, parks, and voter-approved bond repayment. Increased portion of state sales tax redirected to cities, townships, and villages from 10% to 13.33% and from 0% to 6.67% for counties. Shift 10% of state income, marijuana, alcohol, and tobacco tax revenue to local governments. Allow use of this revenue only for listed essential government and infrastructure services, but not for schools, community colleges, parks, or other local government services. Require 60% voter approval for local tax increases. No, sorry, wasn't it supposed to be increases? All right, do we need to print it again? I'll just read it as correct. I'm going to start at that clause again. Require 60% voter approval for local tax increases. Require 2/3 vote of legislature for tax increases greater than 0.1% over 5 years. So to clarify, you'd be approving it with increases
Yes.
in the plural there.
Motion
Do
for
we have a motion?
You know what, I'll do that. I move that the Board of State Canvassers approve the summary of the purpose of the constitutional amendments sponsored by Axe My Tax as drafted and revised, or as drafted?
As drafted. Got it.
As drafted by the Director of Elections and presented by the Director on December 2nd, 2024.
Support.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries unanimously. The next item on our agenda, if I can find it, is consideration of the form of the constitutional amendment submitted by Axe My Tax.
So this is, again, an optional procedure. It's something that the Bureau of Election staff and the board provides as a courtesy to petition sponsors. Petition sponsors are not required to get approval or conditional approval as to form, but they are required to provide a copy to the Bureau of Elections of the petition before they start circulating it. So in this case, we're talking about the form of the petition, whether it meets the statutory requirements, font size, required language, et cetera. We're not talking about approval of the content of the petition. And in this case, as in most cases, it would be conditional approval because it would be conditioned on the petition sponsors using the 100-word summary that was just approved. So we'd be approving the rest of it, and then on the condition that they replace this wording summary that with the one that you just approved. I know that, and the reason we do that is to prevent the need for a second meeting to approve it. In the past, Member Bradshaw has expressed opposition to this approach, but that is the proposal essentially, that the board approve the form of the petition conditional on them changing the wording of the summary. And we have staff, BOA staff has reviewed it, and it does conform with the statutory requirements as to form.
Any discussion? Member Bradshaw?
I'm just going to say again, I do not do conditional approvals, so I will be voting no on this motion.
Do we have a motion?
I can do it, yeah. I move that the board approve the form of the constitutional amendment submitted by Axe My Tax with the understanding that the board's approval does not extend to 1, the substance of the proposal which appears on the petition, and 2, the manner in which the proposal language is affixed to the petition.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries 3-1. The next item on our agenda, consideration of the proposed de minimis modifications to approved voting system, HART. Director Brader, do you want to tell us what this is about?
Sure. So these are 3 proposed de minimis changes to the HART Verity voting 2.7 system. HART is used in 11 counties in Michigan, including Oakland County. The Election Assistance Commission has approved these as de minimis changes, and a voting system test laboratory has verified that they are de minimis, and that they don't affect the overall operation of the software in a way that would require testing. A de minimis change, and the voting system test laboratory was SLI compliance, and a de minimis change is one which quote, which will not materially alter the system's reliability, functionality, capability, or operation, and that the original hardware and the replacement hardware are electronically and mechanically interchangeable and have identical functionality and tolerances. So the three changes here, the three de minimis changes that we're seeking approval for, have to do with, first, some supply chain and manufacturability improvements. Because some changes to the supply changes, there's an error correction to the part number on a ribbon cable connector. It's just a clerical change. There's a manufacturing improvement to the ballot box handle. So the ballot box that is inside of the tabulator and contains the ballots, they're improving the ruggedness of the handle. They're also adding a note to the assembly drawing to improve the functionality to the way it's manufactured. It includes cord loop distance requirement specifications. There's also in quality improvement to the door fit on the ballot box door. And there is an additional contract manufacturer that's added for the cable that's used. And it's the same manufacturer that currently builds their cables. And so these are meant to improve manufacturing and to clear up the paperwork. The second one is having to do with a printer replacement. We're currently using the Brother PJ723 thermal printer, but that has reached end of life. So they're replacing it with the equivalent updated model, which is the PJ823. They're also having an end-of-life notice for the CFast card from Advantech that's used within the Verity devices. They don't make the 16 gigabyte model anymore, so they're replacing it with the equivalent 32 gigabyte model. And they're also improving the bracket plastic on the Duo printer. And the final change, sorry, no, those are the three changes we're talking about.
The end of life notice seems kind of ominous, but okay, do we have a motion?
I actually have some questions.
Any questions? I'm sorry, Jeanette, of course. you have
Sorry.
questions.
I know it seems trivial and everyone kind of laughs at me when I do this, but if we're talking about questions about voting machines and things that have to get approved, it has to come to this board. And when we're talking about a handle on the ballots, I've been to a recount where the ballots were still in were still in the tabulator. So maybe there was an issue, but it wasn't that. That was a big brown box. On the handle itself, have there actually been any issues, or they're kind of they're getting ahead of everything to make it more? I'm just curious if we've had any issues on that issue at all with those Heart Verity units.
So I haven't personally heard of a handle breaking on this specific model. That's not to say it hasn't happened. But I imagine it happened somewhere if they're making this improvement. So either the handles have broken in some places or they've worn down. And they've identified a better way to manufacture them. Theoretically, it shouldn't really create a major problem if the handle breaks, but anything that could cause the ballot box to be broken, if it were to accidentally drop and the seal were to break, that could create an issue for recountability. I imagine it could also be a safety issue for anybody handling the ballot box. So I don't know of any specific instance in Michigan. We haven't had 2.7 Verity very long, but I imagine there was an issue somewhere if they're improving this.
And is any of these changes that we do when we're talking about something that's more physical, is there an actual cost to any of these, or are these covered underneath that last 5-year agreement that's paid for by the local municipalities? Because I'm assuming we are now past the first 5 years, correct?
Yeah, we are.
People are shaking their heads, so.
So it depends on the specific contracts in terms of what equipment is, whether they have to pay for replacements or not. I mean, typically when you're talking about purchasing components, especially towards the end of the contracts, if they do need to purchase a new component, they have to pay for that. But if it's something that is, there are certain language in the contract where if they have purchased something with the understanding that they were going to be able to use that equipment for the life of the contract and they have to get other equipment because that's no longer supported, in some cases that's provided without cost. So it just sort of depends on the component in the contract language.
I appreciate that. And I'm assuming that the CFAS card is more like an internal drive card more than anything else.
That's my understanding, but I imagine Member Housecamp would probably have a better.
They have a better idea than me. Um, that concludes my questions.
It'd be nice to know more about the clerical error, but I think we're okay with it.
We have a motion. We have several motions here.
I move that the Board of State Canvassers approve the supply chain and manufacturability improvements ECO 01531 for use in the state of Michigan.
All in favor? Aye. Motion carries.
I move that the Board of State Canvassers approve the device COTS components EOL and printer bracket manufacturing improvement EOC 01649 for use in the state of Michigan. ECO, sorry. See.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
I move that the Board of State Canvassers approve the Brother HL-L 6400 DWVS COTS printer ECO 01658 for use in the state of Michigan.
All in favor? Aye. Motion carries. The next item on our agenda, consideration of the investigation into the qualifying petitions submitted by Cornell West. As I recall, at our last meeting, we just received, or the council had just received from counsel for Mr. West, information responsive, hopefully, to the letter which was sent. Have you done further investigation, Mr. Percassi or Director Brader?
Well, Mr. Vergassi would have more detail. We have begun reviewing some of that information. We don't have information for every single circulator at this point. But the ones that we've gotten, we've reviewed based on the information we have or started to review. Do you have any details that we can share? Yes.
I don't have specific details at this time. We're still going through what my plan is essentially to go through the sample. And this is kind of where I need a little bit more guidance from the board as to what exactly we're supposed to be looking for with this and the scope of this. So we are going through the sample that was pulled and comparing what was provided to us by the West campaign against the circulator block. And then we've started that. I don't have like final numbers. We're very early still in our review of it, but that's kind of the first step. I guess is what I'm trying to say, that we're going to be looking at unless there's different direction from the board.
So in some, the investigation is ongoing.
Correct.
And what you're looking for is simply whether the signatures provided to us match the signatures on the circulator affidavits?
Or the sample.
For the sample, right.
On the circulator block on the petition sheet, correct.
When do you anticipate that the investigation will be finished?
I think it probably depends on whether there are any initial checks that leave us sort of uncertain as to whether the identity is the same, and also for those individuals where we haven't received the information as samples to identify the signature of the circulator, when we can get that. And if we're not able to get it, or if the campaign doesn't provide it, then we would have to come back to the board and talk about other steps to try to get that information. I know that's not really a detailed answer, but I think we will be able to do what we can with the information we have pretty quickly. It's just those other factors that we don't have. If we don't have the information, it's hard to say exactly when we'll get it.
So I know that 2026 is going to be a busy petitioning year, nominating petitions. And I think that we've discussed adding to our procedure, having the petitioner, whether it's a nominating petition or a ballot question, submit signature for the challengers. I'm sorry, not for the challengers, signatures for the circulators.
Yeah, so that would be a procedure. I mean, we'd need to look at what the board can and cannot legally require for drives to submit. It's certainly something we could ask for. But I think if we would want to look into that and after doing a legal review, come up with a recommended procedure for the board to talk about, if we're going to be doing that.
Well, and I think that the court suggested that we need a procedure because they were dissatisfied with the assertion that we don't have a procedure to check the circulators or signatures. So we need to do it. Yeah. And we've got a little time, but clearly it's something that is important.
Understood. Just, we, in terms of requiring petition drives to submit information to us, that's where we would need to get some legal opinions on what we can. I understand the court said that the board should have a procedure, but there still are questions as to legally what we can and cannot require.
If we don't, we promise not to send anybody to the tower. Your approach here, if I'm getting it correctly, you may have enough information on at least the Michigan residents whose documents were submitted here to go back to Sec State, look at, confirm two things. One, confirm that those documents are legitimate, current. Two is confirm that the signature matches.
Yes, certainly for some of them, we can do that.
So we can start there.
Yes.
And then do we need to send letters, do you think? And maybe this is a question for all four of you guys, but do we need to send letters to the out-of-state individuals that with some type of a form that requests a notarized sample?
I mean, that would be an option. I think, our first step is to try to get the information from the campaign. And theoretically, they would have that or they could have that at least for both the in-state and out-of-state circulators. If it's an out-of-state circulator, if essentially they don't have a Michigan driver's license or some sort of voter registration information, we're not going to have the ability to verify that. Although I guess we would if there was an out-of-state. Well, yeah, I guess there could be various out-of-state documents that we could use for signature comparison. So I take that back. But I guess if the campaign tells us definitively that they don't have that information, then I think the only way would be to try to get it directly from those individuals. But I don't think we've really talked about a specific way of doing that.
And you haven't exhausted that until you've talked to the campaign.
Correct. The correspondence thus far has been through the Attorney General's office with the campaign's attorney.
So how do we know, what is the next piece of communication that has to go to the campaign attorney?
I honestly don't think we're going to get anything more from the campaign, but I could follow back up to Mr. Debus and just say, please explain. We could draft another letter from the board that says something along the lines of, Mr., please confirm what, if any, continuing efforts you are making to contact the remainder of the circulators, which would give us confirmation as to whether they're doing anything else, which I suspect not. But we could do that and confirm that they're not making any continuing efforts. Or we could try again to ask for specific documents that we think the campaign might. They didn't use an organization, right? And I don't understand whether these people were paid or not. They say volunteers. So
It seems like the The campaign is telling you that they didn't hire anybody to gather signatures.
That's what I
That's what you're just saying,
understand.
but so it's fair if we ask them to provide the campaign organization that they hired, who might have hired that
They
company?
didn't hire anybody.
But someone hired the organization to collect signatures,
Letter.
or not?
That they didn't use an organization.
Yeah, I guess we can't tell based on their letter response how all of the circulators were contacted, hired to circulate signatures, whether they were paid or volunteers, you know, who made the outreach. I guess we don't have that information, all that information.
So it's possible that just by virtue of swarm mentality, people from all over the country gathered in Michigan with petitions in hand, all identical, to collect signatures for the West campaign. That's a little bit far-fetched, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the answer is I don't know how, you know, all these individuals got connected with the campaign or started circulating petitions. You know, as the Attorney General's office indicated, we could loop back around with the campaign and see if there's any other information or insight they can provide to us. Beyond that, you know, again, we could try to reach out to the circulators themselves based on the contact information that's on the petition sheets.
That's the other option, is to reach the circulators and ask them who hired them. Or if they were hired.
Right.
And if they were hired and paid, presumably there's documentation which would provide their signatures. I think as Mr. Hauskamp suggests, it's unlikely that volunteers came from other states to circulate these petitions. Not impossible, but unlikely. So when, I know that there is a recount going on, but when do we anticipate the further examination of the signatures and the you know, in comparison with the sample?
Okay, so the next meeting, we can certainly give you a more detailed update of our review of the materials that we already have. And then we can provide some additional information about what else we can do to try to get additional information on the other individuals.
Anything else?
No, but I know with the holidays coming up, you folks all have busy schedules as well. So, I mean, just informally, if that spilled over into January, it's not an issue here with us, okay? We're fine with that.
Understood.
Next item on our agenda is any other business, and I guess we would like a report on the recount.
Sure, I can provide a sort of general report. So we got the recount request for the House District, what House District, do you remember now? 44, thanks, Adam. That came from the HADSMA campaign. I don't believe we got an objection. We did not get an objection from the Frisbee campaign. So we have scheduled that recount to begin on Monday, December 9th. It will be happening in Marshall, is that right? Yeah, in Marshall, Michigan. So it'll start Monday, December 9th. We expect it to be completed by the 12th. Exactly how many of those days and hours you need is to be determined, but we do expect to be done by the 12th, no later than then. And then we will have that recount report results for the board at the meeting, which I think we're scheduling for the 16th. And it is a recount of the every precinct, right? So it's a full recount of every precinct in the district. Early voting, absentee voting, and election day precincts.
You took my question.
Any questions about that? And we have a meeting scheduled on the 16th to
Right. Well, yeah.
certify the results, assuming that it's finished by the 12th.
Yeah, I think we haven't updated the notice yet, have we?
Not yet.
So we'll officially notice it, but yes, we're planning to notice it for the 16th.
Okay.
And the other meetings would be canceled.
Right, we had a meeting,
I think we had one for the 11th
right.
and the 20th, and we'd basically just be combining those on the 16th.
Anything further from any board members?
Anybody on? Do we have anybody on who wants to speak?
Oh,
Mr. Gallant.
Mr. Gallant? Oh, you are with us. Mr. Gallant, we're going to give you 2 minutes today.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All righty. Well, thank you very much. I do appreciate that. It's James Gallant, Marquette County Suicide Prevention Coalition. And I'd like to just to recap our debate that we've been going on with here for some time now. And that the Department of State's legal director, Mike Brady, has determined that public bodies in Michigan must follow Robert's Rules of Order under the Michigan Constitution. And as he instructed Secretary of State Benson to do, as she presided at the public meeting, the Independent Redistricting Commission. And you continue to rely on, as you said from the chair, a 50-year-old Attorney General assumption by refusing to comply with Robert's Rules of Order like you just did today. You just did the business. You just did that de minimis thing. Yeah. Oh, got the questions first. Got to get the discussion in first. Oh, yeah, that's right. You let Bradshaw do that. And then you just went on and just didn't follow Robert's rules at all. And so what this appears is that you, Madam Chair, are committing unauthorized practice of law right there from the chair today at this meeting. And it looks like Marxist style communism in action because you don't know where it's going to go. You're the dictator, facilitator, consensor, blah, blah, blah. So please request a legal opinion from your Attorney General legal team here today, Mr. Gill and Heather, in light of the legal director Brady's written opinion from 2020 that I submitted to you during the public hearing, that again, Madam Chair, your legal advice to the other members, Member Brader, or Member, Daunt and the rest of us, that they didn't have to actually attend, and Secretary Bader didn't actually attend the public hearing. So I was denied public hearing. I didn't get the board. You didn't hear it. The board wasn't there. You have to have a public hearing during a public meeting. So you didn't even have a public meeting. No members were there. And Adam Fracassi acted as a secretary of this board because you're supposed to have a public meeting. You have a public hearing during the public meeting, just like you did today. And Adam Fracassi, by law, Secretary Brader is a secretary by law, appointed by Secretary Benson. So you all know all this. So what this is unauthorized practice of law by you, Madam Chair, and Jonathan Brader. And this is going to be the Michigan Bar Association. I already talked to him about that, and I'm going to file a complaint. And now, but for you attorneys that are practicing here today for clients, the Attorney General, folks, and Mr. Liedl and Mr. the other guy there that we see all the time, all the constitutional experts.
Again, for your contribution. You know that we have considered both your written and oral presentations to us. Anything further? Okay, the meeting is adjourned.